Thank you for coming, and you're all extremely welcome. Lovely to see you all. And I'd like especially to welcome Maria Simonds-Gooding. It's an honour for us, frankly, that she's agreed to show in such an upstart little gallery as ours. And Poppy Melia, of course, for being in conversation with Maria. I'm sure it'll be fascinating. And there'll be, you can ask Maria questions, of course, at the end. All the work is for sale. The paintings are for sale, framed, as you see them. The plaster reliefs are not for sale. That's correct, isn't it? Well, they are.
They're for sale.
They're for sale. Yeah. The prints are for sale, but only unframed. And I can show you them sort of individually later in the afternoon. And before I hand you over, I'd just like to tell you about another exhibition that we have on in Killarney at the moment, which is called Kerry Art Now, and that's 20 professional Kerry artists, and that exhibition is on at the government offices until middle of June, so plenty of opportunity to see that. Maria.
Okay, what am I?
No. So, how lucky are we to have a gallery that attracts artists of this high calibre here in Kerry and Killarney. Lucy and Robert, you're doing an amazing job, and it's been recognised by the press as well, so nationally. I was delighted to be asked to open Maria Simonds-Gooding's show. What land and country is this? On trips I've made to Greece and Lanzarote and Dunquin, I have recognised the landscapes from Maria's paintings, and for me, they have become synonymous with her. It seems quite serendipitous that this year that I'm opening her exhibition, because I've known her for 50 years this year.
When you were 8 years old.
8 years old. And you asked me, did I remember
that first meeting?
Yeah. And I did, because of course Maria is strong woman, and she was wearing this Ella Coffey dress, which is a black woolen dress made by a travelling lady. Yeah, and it was embroidered with brightly coloured wool and slightly crooked. And my mum, shortly after that, got Holly and myself one made, and Mum had one as well. So we all had Ella Coffey dresses, and we got dolls made and everything as well. So Maria was born in India and moved to Kerry in the late 40s when she was 8. Completely new to the scene, a completely new scene in Buncar and Dukes, with no electricity, no car, no phone. And Maria and her sister Patricia and her mom, they used to take a horse and cart to Killarney, and the horse was quite frisky, and they'd tie the horse up in Killarney, and Maria and Patricia would head on down to Foley's the Bridge, the toy
just
shop.
here, it still exists,
Yeah.
doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, next door now it's Shades, but it's still the toy shop there. So then my mom, years later, my mum met Maria for the first time in the late 70s or mid 70s in the Projects Art Centre in Temple Bar in Dublin. And it was just before we moved to Kerry, and Maria and Mum, you hit it off. We're best friends ever since. And Maria is actually responsible for finding the valley that we lived in and pointing my mum and dad in that direction. So I'm hugely indebted to you, Maria, because we absolutely love living there. So as everybody knows, Maria has boundless enthusiasm for life. Her interest in Homo sapiens' mark on the inhospitable landscapes has remained her inspiration throughout her life. The fascination brought her to travel far and wide, seeking out these little oases in isolated landscapes. She is always full of admiration for people eking out a subsistence existence from the land, struggling both with and against nature. Each of Maria's works is a powerful homage, filled with respect for the people and the land. You can feel from her work the intention is pure and unaffected by anything other than her passion. Maria's work has been described by Patrick Murphy, director of the Royal Hibernian Academy, as, in the best modernist sense, reductivist, deliberately absenting the unnecessary. She has experimented, developed and perfected several different complex techniques, sometimes combining them: etching, painting, embossing, carborundum, working directly on zinc plates with kitchen scrubbers, making heavy plasterworks in her studio in Dunquin. You can see the fine skill and energy she puts into her work. They're perfectly executed, but they're not just satisfying to look at. I think her striking works evoke a deep primeval feeling in us, drawing us to them. So Maria, you told me that you were that since you were a child you wanted to be an artist. Did your parents encourage that?
No, I think like most parents, they thought that's the last thing they want, because they think if you're not going to make a living, we'll have to direct you to something else. But when my mother saw that nothing would stop me, and I did all sorts of weird jobs, like I was a matron in a Benedictine monastery in Sussex, Worth Abbey. And then I went up to London, and after a while I got an interview, passed my second interview to be an air hostess. When I told my mum, she said, "Come back, do art, do art." And that was it. And then once she saw there was no stopping, she would then back me up. But before that, she would put every obstacle in your way. But I think most artists that remain doing their art are very determined people, because I know when I went to Bath Academy, they said out of every 300 students that passed all their exams and everything, only 1 out of 300 remained with their art. So, you know, you have to have, you just have to want to do it. It has to be a compulsion.
And you went to a few different art schools, NCAD and one in Brussels.
Yeah, no, they're all hopeless. Total. I wasted 5 years of my life. At least I knew very quickly when a place was no good, a teacher was no good, totally dominant, like in Kildare Street as it was. There were plaster heads, and Maurice McGonagall would come in, and he'd lift my hand up and put it on the head as if I couldn't even see what I was doing. And I thought, well, I stuck it for a year. But there were other artists who, very unfortunately, stuck for 3 years, and I think they had all the art wiped out of them totally. And so anyway, I only spent a year there. I only spent a year in Brussels because I had the opposite. I had a Monsieur Ribon, and he loved to slush on all my oil paint and make his own paintings. So I wasn't being taught anything. And then, just to show you that the wonderful chances, that moments in life when I knew there was something in me that hadn't been tapped. I didn't know what it was, and I knew I couldn't do it myself alone. And I walked into Henrik's gallery and to ask them, did they know, I thought of a residential school because I thought it'd be easier if there was. And they said they didn't know, but Cecil King, the artist, would know. And as I was going down the stairs, who was coming up was Cecil King, and he said, the place is Bath Academy. It's very difficult to get into, and Bath Academy changed my life, but that's another story.
Yes, they got you to do life studies with a line or something.
Oh yes, so
set you up.
oh yes, so anyway, my painting tutor was Adrian Heath. And it just shows you how one person can be affected and not anybody else. And drawing from life, I used to find very boring because I was more interested in landscape. But he said, today, I want all of you to use the model and draw from the model a line in any direction, from anywhere to anywhere, but to use the model. And suddenly I felt like a bird let out of a cage, and I realized the power of line, and you can express so much and very deeply if you really feel where it's going and what it can do. And so that then changed everything forever after that. And so it's always in life, it's always trying to find your thing. And probably when you start out, you're not quite sure what it is you're looking for, which is quite a difficult time. But if you keep at it, you'll get there. So you just have to keep at it.
That's wonderful. Lots of your pieces take a huge amount of physical effort. When I was admiring a huge piece of plaster work in her studio when I was there recently, and I was wondering, can you tell us a little bit about your how you make them and what you do in your studio?
Well, okay, so actually it started in Bath. So it's a good point you asked that question, because when Adrian Heath said to draw this line from wherever to wherever in the model, and then I thought at the end of it, God, think if I had a big board and I covered it with plaster and I drew a line into it, and that's how it all started.
Yeah. And
then I built up on the board. I'd have a very rough first surface, so the next surface would hold on very well with polybond in the first one. And then I like a chalky finish, and then it wasn't to be too thick, not too heavy, and then it just went on from there. So it's just like when the door opened and you see it, and that's it.
And they're absolutely huge, some of them, and I couldn't believe that she actually made them there on her own in her studio. And she told me that you lock the door, take the phone off the hook.
Yes, I have to, because you see, when you're working with plaster, you can't do half of it, and a bit later there'll be a mark right down forever. So you have to do the whole thing in one go. You have to have everything at the ready, all your tools. And once I got a plasterer from down the road in Groy. I know he was very good at plastering, but when it came to this sort of plastering, oh no, that's not how you do it, and you do this and you do that. So that didn't work. So I had to absolutely do it myself. And physically, you had to be really up to it, because, as I say, you couldn't have a break. And when I asked another artist to help me, it's just different.
Yeah,
you know, you have to do it yourself. So you have to get organised so you can do it before it sets.
And tell us a little bit about painting with my mum, Pauline Buick.
Oh yes, I remember. Oh yes, it was 1985, and I was having what Peter, oh God, what's his name that ran the Crawford Gallery? Murray, thank you. Peter Murray said, we're going to have a midterm retrospective. And I had lots of plasterwork, so I couldn't believe I had so much work. And I thought, God, if I never did another painting, that's enough, sort of thing. And I thought, I'm going to celebrate. So I rang up Pauline, I said, meet me in Kenmare. And we met up, and off we went to lots of lovely spots. And Pauline would sit there, and she'd fly along with her painting. And I was sort of thinking, what will I do now?
That's not the way to work.
She just finished, and I loved her spontaneity, and I introduced colour then into my work for 2 years as one of those, and then I went back to my plaster work. So all these things play their part as you go through life. You never know quite what is going to be of relevance until later.
The way you get these different influences. There's a piece at the back there on an easel called Mount Sinai, St. Catherine's Monastery, and it has an amazing story. And perhaps you tell everybody the story of that.
Okay, so I was in Egypt, and I was with a friend, and we were in Cairo, and she pulled out a book in the Mina House Hotel. And it had written, and I'd never heard of it, St. Catherine's Monastery, Sinai, huge book. And I looked at it and I thought, wow. I said, we've got to go there, to hell with wherever we were going, up the Red Sea and I don't know where. I said, we've got to go to this monastery. And in fact, I advise you all to go. At St. Catherine's Monastery, Sinai, it's 5,000 feet up. It's one of the oldest monasteries in continuous existence in the world, and it goes back to before the 6th century. And anyway, we got there. There was a bus that lets you off at a sort of a crossroads in the middle of nowhere, and then we were told if we walk for a mile we'd find this monastery, and you were allowed to sleep in what they call the hospice, sort of outside the monastery. It's part of the monastery grounds, but not in the monastery. And I did drawings of the monastery, and then I eventually did the etching, which you see back there, and then then I went back. I've been to the monastery 3 times over several years. And when I went back to the monastery the second time, I gave the Archbishop that etching, and then Father Andrianus, who was a hermit monk, I gave him another etching, I think it's further back, and Father Andrianus said in Greek to the bishop, and the bishop translated in English, and Father Andrianus says, "Where am I in the picture?" This holy monk of 40 years. And then what happened was the Metropolitan Museum in New York were doing a fantastic big exhibition called The Glory of Byzantine, and they visited the monastery many times because they had beautiful, wonderful icons going way, way, way back, and they were borrowing something, and they saw that etching in the monastery, and then the monks didn't know where I was from or anything, they're in another world, so they don't remember these things. And so then they found me through the internet, that's long, long ago. And so they bought that etching, and they have it on permanent display in a place for visiting sort of professors and that type of thing. So from that remote place in St. Catherine's Monastery, it just shows you that something then can happen from there to New York Metropolitan Museum. You just never know how it works.
Absolutely wonderful way
Yeah.
to discover it as well.
Yeah.
Does anybody else want to ask some questions of Maria?
Yeah. At what age did you realise that you had an artistic talent? Were you very small or?
Very small.
Very small, no.
Yes, so I knew, well, I didn't know exactly that I wouldn't have thought of it like an artistic talent, but I was barely able to walk. So I was 2 or 3, and I was in India, and my ayah, like my nanny, we were walking on the side of the mountain, and there was this field. I remember it was on my left side, cornfield, and all I could dream of was asking my nanny to carry me back to that field. I didn't want anything else but that field. And fields have always been part of my work. So I think that it started right then, right away.
Wow.
And often, you notice, very often young children are wonderful artists, but then they normally, when they get to 12 or a bit more, they give it up, which is a pity. But they probably have loads of talent, but they don't continue it.
Yeah, they lose the
Yes,
freedom.
Yes, the freedom. They get self-conscious and they think, oh, I can't draw a line, I can't do this, I can't do that, which is actually, if you have to be totally compulsive, you just have to do it, don't you?
Impulsive.
Oh, impulsive.
Or maybe it's bad teachers.
Yes. Yeah, well, if you have the misfortune to get influenced by them, that could be. There would be so. Yeah, very much so, actually. Yeah.
So what would your advice be to aspiring young artists starting out to avoid that, getting programmed by art education?
I think what I would do is I'd need to know the person. I would need to know how much they need a bit of guidance. Some do, some don't. And then I would kind of try and see what art schools are available in what countries. Just try to direct them to a place that will get what they have in them, out of them. Or even just a particular person who if they gave them a few lessons, anything can trigger it off. But I certainly avoid sort of say you've got to do 4 years study and get a degree and all that kind of stuff. I'd avoid that. I know it's a bit chancy because then you can't be an official teacher, can you, without qualifications?
But hopefully if you have a passion, you'll continue to paint.
That's it, you
Yeah.
do it. As long as you have the passion.
passion, yeah.
Yes.
I'd like to ask something a bit quirky. I seem to remember, Maria, that you had a big passion for fungi and a very special relationship. Could you tell us about that? I seem to remember Pauline Buick once said you wanted to marry him.
Well, I mean, there's another perfect example. A freaky situation had happened, just like these things I've been telling you. And one day I went into Dingle and suddenly I got a terrible cramp. I thought, God, I feel I want to lie down on the road. It felt so bad. And there was a bench outside the library in Green Street. And I sat on the bench and the librarian arrived at 10 o'clock. And then I walked in and I wanted to try and look like I was fine. And I said, oh, do you have a book on the Dingle Peninsula? I said, a book on the Dingle Peninsula? Many books. And I said, then just anything to sort of look normal. And I said, what about the dolphin? And she said, oh yes, the first book that had ever come out that was written by Ronnie Fitzgibbon on him finding the dolphin, swimming with the dolphin, never written before. And it was the most beautiful book. I read it from cover to cover. No cramp, got into my car. I went to John O'Connor, who was the person who swam with Ronnie Fitzgibbon. They were the first two to ever spot the dolphin. And in this book it said how they had wetsuits. I didn't know what a wetsuit was. I went to John O'Connor and I said, I found him. And he lives just outside Dingle, and he showed me what a wetsuit was. And I knew, like I know you're all standing there, that it was a very windy day, that out in that very rough ocean, I would be in the water. I hated swimming and all that stuff. I would be in that sea with a wetsuit, have to have a wetsuit. I just knew I'd be there, something I would, before I read the little book, I would not even imagine. And all those things happened. I bought a wetsuit and I never stopped swimming with fungi, and I didn't want to do any drawings of fungi to start with because I wanted to enter into his world and I didn't want to get my preconceived ideas and do nice sort of dolphin things. And I got to know lots of his habits and the way he operated, and he would be watching you and how you operated. And so at first they thought only women got on with fungi, and it wasn't true. It was men with such show-offs, and that fungi didn't like that. He liked people just to be the way they were, and men used to jump and dive up and down and do this and that, and then they got the hang of it. So then in the end, fungi enjoyed himself just as much as men or women. And he became a huge part of my life because there's nothing more, I think, exciting and wonderful when a wild creature, I don't care what it is, a spider, a dolphin, whatever it is, when you build up a trust and there's a connection between you, whether it's a blackbird or whatever, and that's what happened between me and fungi, and then I've used it in lots of situations with wild creatures. And so that it's sad he's not there, but he was there for, I think, nearly 40 years. He broke all records, and people loved him. And the fishermen that took people out to see fungi, they weren't commercial at all. They loved it and they wanted people to be happy, and it was all about happiness and love. People would go out and they'd be very sort of dolphins, stupid dolphins. And then the next thing is they're crying because they're so moved by this wonderful creature. He just affected people so strongly. So we were just very lucky in Dingle to have him all that time, 40 years.
And did you spend many years painting influenced by fungi?
No, I didn't while I was working, while I was diving or swimming with them, I didn't. But then I made drawings, and then I remember going to Amsterdam where I made my etchings, and then they all wanted to to print my etchings because
Yeah.
they all fell in love with the dolphin in
Yeah.
Amsterdam.
How lovely.
Yeah,
So yes, that was absolutely fantastic, Maria. I
yeah.
loved hearing
That was
about
good.
that.
It was good to chat
Yeah.
and to hear
Did
your
I see
question.
somebody put up their hand there? No.
Could I ask you why you decided to settle in Blue Queen and your connection with that place meant more to you?
Okay, so I'll tell you, the very man of this building, Mr. Henry Dodd.
Oh.
So he said, I was living in Dukes as we were in those days. And Henry said, would you like a trip out to the Dingle Peninsula? And I thought, God, I love the sound of that place because they're very wild out there. And if there's any English, they cover it with paint. And I thought, they sound to be really interesting people. And Henry took me out there on Sunday, the 16th of June, 1963, and we arrived outside Cruger's at 4 o'clock, and it was shut. And then we walked down, and Henry was very, very good at languages, and he had plenty of Irish, plenty of French. I said, Henry, you've got to speak Irish, you've got to speak Irish all the time. You see, and I wouldn't open my mouth. And then I would ask Henry to ask them this and this, are they all bachelors here that was lying in the grass? And then they thought I was an inspector of the Irish language. And so from that day on, I just loved everything. I loved the landscape, the starkness of it, the culture, the language, the music, the remoteness, everything about it just was, it just captivated me. So from that day, that was it. I was a goner.
So you seem to like everything pure and unpretentious.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, just a little more raw than,
Yeah.
But I mean, I love this place. And by the way, talking about meeting me for the first time when you were 8,
Yeah.
I just have to mention Puck Fair since I'm in this wonderful Cologlan. And I remember my mother said, well, going into Puck Fair, I would have been 8, and we would get on the train at Duke's Halt. The next stop was Cologlan. And then Ella Coffey was at Puck Fair, like many of the travellers, and she was wearing a wonderful black satiny jacket with embroidery. And I went up to her very polite. I said, Ella, I didn't know her name then, and I said, would you sell your jacket? And she said, very politely, she said, no, but when I come off the drink, after 6 weeks, I'll stitch you one. And I have a whole collection of wonderful stitching.
Yeah. And we do as well now.
What?
And we do as well.
Yes,
As
yeah,
well.
yeah.
Yeah, they're amazing.
Yeah, so I have wonderful associations with Colognan. It's a very special place in my whole childhood. And coming into Colognan probably once a week or maybe a fortnight with my mother and my sister, we polish our bags up the night before, put everything out, the shoes, the bags, we're going into Colognan. And then we come down the hill, my sister and myself, we go into Foley's, I think it was Foley's shop.
The bridge, yeah.
We only got a penny pocket money a week, and we were used to India where you bargain. And I remember we'd say very politely, we'd ask Foley's, would they put the toy, that toy, could we look at that toy? And then we'd say, now, which one will we buy? And then my sister and I would decide we'd buy that toy, and then we put up 2, 3, maybe 4 pennies on the counter, hoping she'd accept them, but she never did. So these are all sort of memories of Colognan, Puck Fair, and all those wonderful things. Yeah, great charm, great charm.
Can I just ask, originally, were you with your father and mother from Colognan? What was the connection when you came back from India?
Okay, so the connection was, my father was English, my mother was Irish. Her maiden name was Riley, Dorothy Riley. And she had 2 aunts called Lucy and Mamie Murphy, who lived in Dukes. They had a little sort of a shack, was what is now beside the golf club, which was only tiny then. And we spent a few months there. And my father, who had to go back to India for another year, I think, he said, "This is the place I want to retire. This is the place I want to live in." And so we bought bunker house from Northern people, I think, called McCruhan. And they owned bunker house, totally derelict. My mother bought it from them. We had 12 acres. There was a shortage of land. It was 120 acres, and they divided it up. And those were the most happiest days in that beautiful bunker house with the courtyard and stables and the Matty reeks and all the birds and so on. A great upbringing.
It's like
Have you
a,
had a pet pig? Was
Yep.
a pig, Bessie?
And that was the cow.
slightly different.
We had 2 pigs, and Bessie was the cow.
Yeah, and then hens and ducks.
That's what?
Hens and ducks.
Oh yeah, we had a bit of everything.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's like a full circle from living as a child there and now having an exhibition here in
Yeah, it's
Killarney.
amazing.
It's wonderful.
It is
And it's
amazing.
beautifully hung.
Oh, it is.
Lucy and Robert.
Oh, yes.
It's absolutely
Lucy
fantastic.
and Robert, I
Yeah.
have to
Yeah.
absolutely congratulate
Yeah.
you. I have had many. I have had many exhibitions, and apart from Betty Parsons, who I think there were I only had 6 very large plasterworks
New York.
in New York, and she put 1 plasterwork on each wall. But apart from that exhibition in that space, this is far the best hanging, far the best everything. Totally, the way it's hung is not a way I would ever dream of, and it's so much better. And I'm simply delighted with it. And thank you very much, Robert and Lucy. I think you've done
And
a
thank you.
wonderful job.
Thank
Thank
you,
you all
Maria.
for coming.
Yeah.